We are delighted to have Dr. Emilie Leumas as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Leumas is the Director of Archives and Records for the Archdiocese of New Orleans and Curator for the Old Ursuline Convent Museum. She is also the Chair of the International Council on Archives Expert Group on Emergency Management and Disaster Preparedness. She has received national and international recognition for her efforts in disaster recovery after Hurricane Katrina. Emilie has participated in recovery efforts after local and regional disasters, especially those related to flooding in South Louisiana. She has presented conference papers, facilitated workshops and seminars on subjects including disaster recovery, risk management, salvaging sacred objects, archives management, and records management. She speaks nationally and internationally on subjects including Louisiana French, Louisiana Catholic Church history, archival research methods, archives management, records management, and disaster recovery. So welcome, Emilie.
So hello, everybody. First, I want to thank the organizers, Christine, Michelle, and Heather, for inviting me to speak today. And from looking at the program, you have a wonderful selection of sessions that cover emergency management and disaster preparedness. I've read through the list and see there are sessions about paranoid people and dinosaurs and disaster planning, fire, water, lessons learned, etc. So you have a really good day in front of you. My job is to kick off the day with a rousing keynote speech and hopefully keep you from gazing away from your computer, sweeping the kitchen or dusting the living areas. I know what happens when we are attending video meetings and conferences, and truth be told, I have done a bit of cleaning and sometimes even exercising while in attendance. So I think it's probably a good thing that we're not all being able to share our videos and see just exactly what everyone's doing while they're engaging in this day's symposium. So let me get started. I couldn't help but, since this is a symposium for libraries and archives, also to share this is one of my favorite slides somewhere in Spain that is archives and libraries, and it's just wonderful to be able to see this marriage together. So how did I get here? I'm a native New Orleanian. I grew up with a father who is a meteorologist and a hurricane expert. And growing up in South Louisiana, our neighborhood watched to see where the hurricane in the Gulf was going and did their preparations based on the fact of if my father boarded the windows and took the garbage cans in on that day. That was our neighborhood alarm. They would call the house even to my mother and asked, my father's name is Lawson, did Lawson take the garbage in? Which meant if the garbage cans were off the curb, this must really be serious. And that would sound the alarm for the couple of blocks and for all of our friends in the neighborhood that my father, as the meteorologist and hurricane expert, was expecting something. My first memory of a hurricane was Hurricane Betsy, which had landfall in New Orleans on September 9th, 1965. I was very young at the time, but we had to run across the street in the rain and gale force winds to get to the neighbor's two-story house. We lived in a one-story house. That was our evacuation to safety. It's still a flash of memory because I was running across the street with my mother and the neighbor. My mother had the dog. My two brothers and I were all holding hands in between the neighbor, and the wind was blowing and they were trying to keep our feet on the ground. So it's an experience that, even though I was young, has been emblazoned into my brain. And as I said, that was our evacuation strategy. We learned to live without electricity for weeks. The neighborhood men grilled meat from the refrigerators that weren't going to last in the middle of the street so that everybody could eat. And we donated our toys to those that had lost everything. And we thought little of that as children. It was just an adventure. Fast forward to 2005, and I was Director of Archives and Records at the Diocese of Baton Rouge when Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans. At that time, my father was retired from meteorology, and he evacuated to Baton Rouge with my mother and my 96-year-old grandmother. And I remember calling my brother and saying, I think this is going to be bad. And my brother then said, our father has never left the city, and he is evacuating for a Category 5 storm, heading straight for us. And you have a funny feeling about this? I tell this story because all of us can relate to a disaster. It may not be a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane or a fire that's destroyed our office building or an earthquake that's flattened our village. It may just be that we have lost electricity for a day or two due to a blizzard, had a kitchen fire, had a water heater that busted and flooded our homes and ruined the floors, a coffee that spilled on our important documents, or just simply we dropped our phone in the toilet, which in itself is always a disaster. All of these disasters, on some level, we have to address and have to mitigate. Besides the Category 5, in my work as an archivist and records manager, we've had pipes that have burst in the wall and flooded an area that had documents, very critical, vital documents, and we had to mitigate against that. We've had a soap dispenser fall over the weekend onto a sink, turning on the faucet that then ran for 48 hours, flooding one entire floor of a building. We've also been, on a Friday afternoon, given a time capsule that was cut out of a building that the workmen didn't know were there, and so they used a wet saw, so now there was wet mud and all kinds of dust, and just the contents of the time capsule were in terrible condition. And this always happens on a Friday afternoon. But I'm going to go back to this slide. This is Katrina. In what we now see when the emergency managements come in, this is a slide taken from a board at my house on the front door that marked what team had come in to check the house on 9/10, September 10th. And the other two X's on the quadrant that have 0 meant that there were 0 problems, meaning the electricity and the gas were off, and that there were 0 bodies found in the house. For me, this Category 5 hurricane changed everything. It changed my life, and it changed my career in immeasurable ways. Who knew that such an event would catapult my career and put me on an international stage where I now chair the expert group on emergency management and disaster preparedness for the International Council on Archives? Truth be told, it was a lack of resources that threw us into a third world environment that taught me lessons that I will forever be grateful for. It allowed me to view disaster management in a different light and to teach it in different ways with a basic hands-on approach and with simple techniques and guidelines. Because when there is no electricity or you are in the middle of a disaster, being able to just call a refrigerator truck to come get everything is not always available. And it's just what people think that we do, and it just doesn't always happen. As my part of my work with ICA, I'm currently writing with another colleague a workbook that is based on seminars and training that we have done in many countries around the world. Recently, just before the pandemic, I did a training, a 5-day training for protecting cultural heritage and the development of disaster plans for government stakeholders in the country of Suriname. We did building surveys, we looked at the libraries, the archives, and all the other cultural institutions that are in Paramaribo, Suriname, and all of those stakeholders were there participating, knowing that protecting cultural heritage is one of the things that we must all do. So where do we start? There's a difference between where we start, where we should start, versus where we are forced to start. So this is where I'm going to do a very brief outline of some of the things I hit and the highlights when I do a presentation that is days long or sometimes weeks long, but it'll frame out how I think that you should focus your day or what you're taking in from the day, because you're going to be hit with a lot of information that sometimes will feel like it's overwhelming. Normally, when we look at disaster management, we look at these 4 critical areas: response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. What happens is we get thrown into response because something happens. There is a catastrophic event, and we have to quickly respond. Recovery is that time period of trying to get back to regular services. It's that, oh my God moment of, we cannot go through this again, so how do we rebuild better? Mitigation, and I'm going to look even further into mitigation a little bit further down in the presentation, is all about risk assessment. And that's, after recovery, we look at that and go, okay, how can we do this better? And what parameters and things can we put into place that this does not happen at this level again? And then we prepare accordingly. Where I think that we need to be is in the mitigation first, because otherwise we're in a disaster response mode. These are vital records on baptisms, marriages, and funerals. And in South Louisiana, when the Vital Records Office went down, and people could not get their birth information, they came to the Catholic Church, because so many people are Catholic in South Louisiana, to get their baptism information so that they could get their kids back in school. This is a group of records that we received from a church in Lakeview that was delivered to us 4 months after Hurricane Katrina by FEMA, who had put them in these bags and then brought them to us. We actually were able to save the information, not the books themselves. We got them stable enough that we could then scan everything. There's also the wet and swollen records. Nothing like cramming too many books into a vault and then having them swell to the point where you can't get them out. We had to actually drill some records out, knowing we were losing a book, knowing what was on microfilm at the time or of digital images, so that we could literally kill one book to be able to free the block that was there to get the rest of the information out of the vault. During the recovery, thank goodness for libraries, because the LSU library, Hill Memorial Library, had freezer space, and we were able to take all of our vital records and our books, vital registers, basically, which are volumes, and put them into a freezer at sub-zero so that we could freeze the contents and better be able to deal with the preservation, the conservation, and the recovery of those documents. This took another 18 months. And then we would get records that we would be able to take 2 boxes out of the freezer a week, and then take them, and it was just like frozen meat. They were all stuck together. We learned other processes that made it a little easier by tying cotton tape around each one of the sort of bulk pieces that would allow us to take a couple of records or a couple of folders at a time and then be able to separate them off as it defrosted. We set up a conservation lab with all sorts of equipment, and this was the first time that we had done that. We had experts that were helping us do this to start this process so that we were better able in coming events that to be able to set up a conservation room. And we went through a wet documents drying process. What you see here is we were using Pepsi trays to be able to dry material, and I now use Coca-Cola trays because the archivist for the Global Heritage site of Coca-Cola has asked me never to use Pepsi trays again, and that he would supply me with as much Coca-Cola trays so that I could do the advert for Coca-Cola. It's interesting who you can get supplies from. And then, of course, the interleaving. This is interleaving wet documents. It would take us as I said, about a week to be able to interleave a box of records to get them to a point of recovery. We interleaved twice a day for a week. We would empty our dehumidifier twice a day of 5 gallons of water. We used unbleached newsprint as our interleaver, and then we were setting up on these trays so that air would flow both from the top and the bottom. When you start looking at supplies, and if you want to quickly write down some of these YouTube scenarios so that you can go out afterwards and watch them, I'm not going to play them here because I find that trying to play YouTube over this medium doesn't always work. But a crowbar, you think about all the different drawing supplies that you need, but you don't think about needing a crowbar. If you have file cabinets that have gotten wet, you can't get the material out without breaking the file cabinet. And then this YouTube, which is about 6 minutes long, this is the photograph recovery that we did in 2016 following the Baton Rouge floods. We went out to, actually that crowbar was breaking open a file cabinet that had photographs in it. This area was so heavily destroyed that the homes, everyone had lost all of their pictures. And at the church where the community center, they had files of photographs from their different fairs, and there were lots of people in them. And so we salvaged as many, actually we salvaged 1,100 photographs in 2 days, and basically of people, so that people would be able to come from the community and find their parents and their children and early pictures of themselves and have still some of their own heritage, of family heritage from the church. So now I'm back to that slide. We don't want to be in a time when we're doing that response and recovery, but we all need to be able to prepare for that. When we start looking at the management program, we're looking at mitigation and prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And we need to start it from that end and start it now. So one of the things to do is throughout today, write down things, practical ideas that you can do, because otherwise you will get overwhelmed by the amount of information that's coming in. Risk management deals with that identification, assessment, prioritizing risks. Where are you in what area of the country, and identifying what those risks are, and then coordinating the application of your resources to minimize and monitor and control that probability of those events, because they will happen. There are all kinds of natural disasters. There's all types of man-made disasters. Climate change is forcing us to deal with hurricanes and cyclones like we have not seen before. I know that a colleague of mine is speaking from Miami, and they get hit just as badly as we do, as Houston does, and they are increasing in intensity and in frequency. We are having flooding and coastal flooding. I have a friend that just moved up the East Coast, and she's now in the path of Faye that's coming. We have wildfires. We've seen what's happened in Australia. There's ice storms, there's drought, etc. All of these are being enhanced by climate change, and we need to be prepared. So you need to do a risk assessment. When you're walking around your own facilities, you want to not just look at only the immediate and the local threats, but you want to be able to take a broad view. I was in Grenada, and I love to tell the story that while in Grenada, and I was looking at a facility where they wanted to put their archives and libraries, it was one building, and as I walked around it, I asked what that smell was. I was smelling what I call bagasse, which is a runoff from sugarcane. And I kept thinking, is there a sugarcane refinery somewhere around here? What is that smell? Well, I looked into a small ditch, and it was this oozy, gooky stuff coming from the building next door. And I said, what is that? And they said, oh, that's the rum factory. And that's the runoff from the rum. And I asked, is it flammable? And they said, we don't know. And I said, well, maybe this isn't the best place to put your archives if you don't know if the runoff from the building next door is flammable. And just the fact that it was a rum building with the amount of alcohol that was there, I'm sure it was flammable. Truth be told, I did go and sample the rum and it was very good. So you want to be able to identify and assess the possible risk to your collections. Do you have a collection assessment? Do you know what your priority collections are? Have you sat around and done a tabletop and had everyone come to the table with their priority collections so that you've marked them so that first responders can get in and get them? And then if you've not worked through something like the D plan or any of the other risk in evaluation and planning programs, they are available, and there's quite a lot of good ones now that are available in the United States. So you want to be able to mitigate against these things to be able to drive that risk down. It will never go away, but you will be able to minimize some things. You want to be able to implement those appropriate measures. Again, mitigating those identified risks. You want to start with activities that are most effective and those that are related to you. Some of them you will be able to eliminate, and some you can lessen, and some you'll never be able to address. The building that you're in, if that's where they've told you you are, you may not be able to address being able to move, but you will be able to say, I need to check the fire extinguishers. We need to make sure that the fire crew has come through and given us a clean bill of health. We need to make sure that our best collection isn't next to the bathroom where there could be a leak. And we need to develop a list of tasks that we can accomplish. We need to make sure that our alarm systems are up to date, both for fire, water, and intrusion, security-based knowing, and that can be both on the electronic side as well as the physical side. This should not be your disaster plan. This should not be help, help, and that be it. You should have more than just this. So here's a few traits as I wrap this up of what you want to look for. Your disaster plan, and again, I know there are others that are going to talk about this, needs to be well organized, relevant, and practical. You need to tailor it to your institution's geography, your users, and your priorities. Taking somebody else, I could not take someone else's plan from the north that deals with ice storms and blizzards and put that here in the south. This has to be the product of a lot of your staff involvement. One person cannot write this. You need to have buy-in. It needs to be distributed and read. You need to have it not only on-site but off-site. And you need to have a panel that reviews it and updates it at least annually. You want to test that plan. Have some tabletop disaster scenarios. Get some books wet. Get paper wet. Get photographs wet, and practice running through the response and the recovery steps. What happens if it's non-working items? What's the contact list? I know that you all have a session about communications, and that is critical. Where are your service providers? Who's in charge of the roof? Who's in charge of plumbing? You want to be able to have those on your cell phone. What happens when you have to close the reading room or you have to limit services? You need to review the response times and the standards, and you need to amend the plan if necessary, and then continue to test some of the cleaning and the drying procedures. So in conclusion, when you're preparing for and responding to a disaster, it's never easy and it's never quick. Risk assessment, mitigation, disaster preparedness, and response plan creation, response and recovery significantly increases your chances of recovery. Work with your first responders. When your fire department comes in, invite them to see what you do and why it's critical, why the cultural heritage is important to your community. It's great to invite them for cookies and have them actually teach how to use a fire extinguisher. They are great assets. So my final thoughts: be vigilant. Be patient. This is not something that you can recover and respond to overnight or even plan for overnight. Be prepared for surprises. Take specific recovery workshops, those day-long hands-on wet recovery exercises. Know your collection. Know your maintenance staff and your IT personnel. Bring maintenance staff donuts. They love it. And they will be there to have that meeting with you to make sure that they have certain supplies on hand. Take nothing for granted. And after everything, be safe. Human life is more important than any collection that we manage. You can follow the Emergency Management Disaster Preparedness ICA group on social media, both in Twitter and on Facebook and on the website for ICA. And at that point, I will give you my contact information. And if we have time for questions or anybody has anything that they'd like to ask me, I am here. I'm going to try to be here throughout the day, although I'll be in and out because I have other meetings to attend to at the Archdiocese. Thank you, everybody.